go right. Go right. Oh, it's fine. Better. We're just waiting, like we're just setting up the presentation right now. Almost done. So. Oh, and it's lagging a bit. Oh yeah, what will be on the stream is gonna have a little bit of a delay.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But
Actually, no. They have some.
okay.
The thing
Okay, tell me whenever you're ready.
Okay, I think I'm ready. Yeah.
Okay.
So do I just present here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's go.
Right, so hello everyone. My name is Sumdra, and today I'll be giving you a lecture on the Battle of Itter, which occurred 78 years ago today, on May 5th, 1945. And it's also Cinco de Mayo, so nice coincidence. So the Battle of Itter is often dubbed the strangest battle of World War II for the reason that German soldiers and American soldiers fought together to protect the lives of French honor prisoners. So, quick disclaimer, there are a couple of foreign names. Actually, there are a lot of foreign names in the lecture. So, I did research them up, but, there might be a couple of mistakes in pronunciation. So, with that said, let's get started. So first, I'll be going over the prelude to the battle, and then the prelude, which covers the events of World War I before the battle, and also gives a brief description on the history of Itter, and then the build-up, the days right before the battle, and the actual events of the battle, and finally, the victory and aftermath. So first off, the prelude. So, at this point in May 1945, Germany was very close to collapse. Even if all of the Axis forces wouldn't surrender until 3 months later in August with Japan's surrender, Germany was pretty much out of the war. So the Western Allies, Britain, France, America, they've reclaimed all the lost territory from earlier in the war. So they've regained France, Belgium, Netherlands, so on, the Low Countries. And they've also made their way into Germany itself, capturing cities like Munich, Hamburg, Cologne, so on. And on the other hand, the Soviet forces were taking back Eastern Europe and capturing many Eastern German cities as well. And they were currently fighting in Berlin, and 2 days later, the victory in Europe would be secured. But even as the war was drawing so close to an end, there was still ongoing conflict, especially in Austria, where die-hard Nazi forces were still crawling over the country. So, and one place in particular was Itter in Austria. So Itter is located in the Tyrolean Alps in Austria, and during this point, there were many rumors about an alleged Nazi fortress where die-hard German soldiers would stay there to make their last stand. But this wasn't quite true because the capsule housed prisoners, not soldiers. And a brief history about the capsule. It was built in the Middle Ages, and it passed under many people's possessions, including Bavarian aristocrats, Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, Napoleon himself, and also musician Sophie Mentor. And after World War I, it became popular as a skiing resort because the Alps were snowy during the winter. But after the Anschluss in 1938, where Austria was captured by Austria was integrated as part of Germany, the castle was refitted to be a prison by Eastern European prisoners from the nearby concentration camp of Dachau. And so the prisoners were French honor prisoners from France. So they were all political prisoners who were taken hostage. They were taken hostage by the Nazis between May 1943 and April 1945. So they included two former prime ministers, Paul Renaud and Maurice Gamelin, and also two former army supreme commanders, General Weygand and General Gamelin. Daladier was the previous prime minister. Sorry, I misspoke. And the prisoners also included tennis player Jean Barotra and the sister of Charles de Gaulle, who was the leader of the Free French forces, and who would later be prime minister of France after the war ended. So in any case, these prisoners really did not like each other for both political and personal reasons. So let me go back to the list really quickly. So as I mentioned, Paul Renaud was the former prime minister of France. He really disliked his predecessor, who was Edouard Daladier, and also François de la Roque, who was very right-wing. He did not like the trade unionist leader Leon Johal, who was, as a trade unionist, a left-winger. And then we have the people who collaborated with Marshal Pétain after the French surrender in 1940. So you have General Weygand, you have Jean Barotra, and François de la Roque. And they were really despised by the previous prime ministers and the supreme commanders, Renaud, Daladier, Gamelin. And yeah, so in conclusion, the prisoners despised each other. Yeah. So, during meal times, they sat at separate tables, and then they insulted each other. But they did have a comfortable life at Itter, unlike many other people taken prisoners by the Nazis for a variety of reasons. And they also managed to grab a hold of a shortwave radio, and they actually shared that amongst themselves, which was surprising because they did not like each other. But they did learn a variety of important information through the radio, one of which included the very imminent surrender of Germany. So the French VIPs also eventually befriended Kurt Siegfried Schroeder. So Schroeder was a defected SS officer. The SS was the police units that had sworn loyalty to Hitler. Schroeder defected due to reasons that that were not clearly recorded, but we can say for sure that he had turned against his country with conviction. So on May 3rd, all of the previous SS guards in the castle left after one of them committed suicide, and so the VIPs were left on their own. Which brings us to the build-up to the battle. So, on May 3rd and May 4th, the prisoners were desperate for help. So they sent out two of their fellow prisoners, both of which were from Eastern Europe, and they provided them with English letters to find help from the neighboring towns. So first, they sent out Zolomir Kukovic, who was a Czech electrician, Croatian electrician, sorry. He had been in the Yugoslavian resistance a couple of years ago in 1941, but he was arrested, taken to a concentration camp, and eventually made his way to Itter. So they sent out Kukovic, who rode on a bicycle to the town of Innsbruck, and he met with American Major John T. Kramers. And Kramers, after receiving the news, would start organizing rescue party to Itter. But the French prisoners didn't know of Kukovic's success because they had no way of contacting him. So they sent out someone else, Andreas Krobot, who was a Czech cook. So Krobot was also successful in contacting Allied forces, but not technically Allied per se, because he met with the German Major Joseph Gongo. And more about him on the next slide, but Gongo met up with Captain Jack Lee. So quick info on Gongo and Lee. So Gongo was a German Wehrmacht major, and for much of his life he had been a career soldier, but just like Schroeder, for reasons not very clear, but you could assume that they were tired of the war by now, he defected against the Nazi Party. And upon arriving in Austria in 1945, he established contact with the resistance leaders there, and many of the Wehrmacht troops in the surrounding area was under his command. And in the meantime, Jack Lee, was an American captain who was in command of an armored task force, and he had recently arrived in Austria with George Patton's Third Army. So Lee and Gongo, they meet and they talk, and it must have taken like a lot of nerve for Lee to put his trust in a German soldiers, because at that point the Americans were very near, like they knew that victory was near, and I assume that they didn't want to associate with a German major. And on top of that, the Americans knew about the concentration camps, so they were not very trusting of German troops by this point, which is very understandable. But somehow, most likely through his English letter that was provided to him by Andreas Krobot, Gongo managed to convince Lee that the French prisoners were real, like it was not a trap. And so they set out on Gongo's truck to go to the capital. And they arrived and met the VIPs. And they weren't particularly impressed with Lee because he was a 27-year-old American captain, and he was quite stubborn. And especially the former supreme commanders in particular, Marcelin Gamblin and General Weygand, they really did not want to answer to Lee, who was half their age, and he was a captain when they were like generals, But they put their trust in him because they didn't really have a choice. So that happened, and they also weren't very trusting of the fact that there were German soldiers, which made up like half of the castle's like tiny amount of defenders. But there was no turning back because the Waffen-SS troops would soon be attacking. So quick review of the current alliance up until now. So 10 soldiers from the American Army led by Captain Jack Lee with only one tank, nicknamed the Basan Jenny. So they originally had 7 tanks that were intended to come and help the defenders, but 6 of them had to be turned back for various reasons. So 3 of them couldn't make it across the bridge, and then 2 of them had to defend another bridge. So, yeah. And then there are forces from the German Wehrmacht, who were 60 soldiers led by Major Joseph Gongo. They were all loyal to Gongo, so and not as much to Germany. Some of them weren't even German. There were Polish soldiers and Austrian soldiers amongst them. And then 14 French prisoners, and 5 of them assisted with the defense later on. And then the Austrian resistance, who collaborated with defenders by sending them intel, and the resistance role in the battle is pretty crucial because, first of all, they are what allowed Lee to trust Gongo in the first place. So without them, maybe the French VIPs would have died a horrible death inside the castle. So yeah, And they also sent them like a lot of intel during the battle about like the placement of American troops. So yeah, Austrian resistance pretty important. And then Kurt Schroeder, the defected SS officer I mentioned earlier, who had befriended the French VIPs. And then we have the enemy that was about to attack and besiege the capital. So around 100 to 200 Waffen SS troops attacking from the surrounding woods. So a quick clarification that I think would be helpful, the difference between Wehrmacht and the SS. So the Wehrmacht was more of Germany's like national army, and on the other hand, the SS like swore personal loyalty to Hitler, and the Waffen SS was the combat arm of the SS. There were other SS like units that did other tasks like the secret police, the Gestapo. So they both the Wehrmacht and the Waffen SS committed atrocities. That's true, but generally the Waffen SS were like more fanatic than the Wehrmacht as a general. Not always though, as you can see with Kurt Schroeder, who defected. And so now we get to the battle. Which started at 4 a.m., the 5th of May, 1945. So at 4 a.m., the attack began. So the Waffen SS troops began firing. And they attacked from the sides and the back of the castle, and then they retreated into the surrounding woods when they were fired back upon. So what's happened? Because the tank was positioned in front of the castle at the gatehouse, it was a really dumb idea to attack from that direction. So they attacked from the sides and the back and stuff. So the defenders got into position at various like windows, at all three sides of at the sides and the back of the castle, and most of the prisoners, as well as Schroeder's family, which his wife and 2 daughters, they were escorted into the cellars, which was the safest place for them to be at the moment. And then, unfortunately, a German soldier under Gongo's command escaped the castle, which is really bad because, number one, it undermined the Americans' trust in the Germans. And but they did manage to reconcile their differences, but tensions were running high at the moment. So runaway German soldiers was not the best thing to have. And secondly, the runaway soldier probably alerted the Waffen SS attackers of the castle situation, because before that moment, the Waffen SS did not have any ideas of how large the defense force was, and the soldier probably provided them with a lot of important details, and it's probably and he probably did that and he probably very likely did that. There's probably no doubt about it, because the Waffen SS were known to execute deserters, so he would not want to be seen as a deserter. That makes sense. So from 4 to 10, the Waffen SS troops mostly fired with small arms, but then at 10 they began firing with heavy artillery, so 20 and 80 millimeter guns, and they were employed against the castle walls and the tank. And the tank was knocked out really soon after the big guns came out. And the defenders only had light equipment to ward off the Waffen SS troops, so this was not a good thing. So they had to get help really quickly. So, at one point, 5 of the French prisoners joined in the fight, and one of them was former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud. So he was firing with the rest of his fellow Frenchmen, and then he moved towards the gatehouse, which brought him into a more exposed position. So Lee noticed this and was about to warn Reynaud when Gongo took the lead first. So he ran towards Reynaud, but before he had gotten even 10 feet, he was shot by a sniper and died, unfortunately. And I believe that he wasn't really he didn't necessarily take the bullet for Renaud, most likely, because he wasn't even close to him by the time that he was shot. But it's the sentiment that matters, because he gave his life in the second to last day of the war to save someone from a country that wasn't his own. But Lee and the others had no time to mourn because the situation was looking very bad for Katzwitter. Because as I mentioned before, the defenders had no heavy artillery to fire back at attackers, and now they were even running low on ammunition. And the Waffen-SS was gaining a lot more ground. They were forcing their way into the Katzel, and because remember the tank was out of commission, so they could approach from the front more easily now. And if it came down to it, everyone was ready to fight, sort of like a medieval style siege, like arms, like close combat, like right within the Katzel walls. And Major John Kramers, the American major that I mentioned earlier, he managed to phone Lee he managed to contact Lee through the telephone, and Lee told him that the situation was really bad, but didn't manage to give him information on where the Katzel was and how many surrounding enemy troops were in the area, and so on. So these vital information didn't make it to Kramers before the telephone line was blew up by artillery. So at this pivotal moment, at this moment, French tennis player Jean Barotra, he volunteered to escape outside of Katzel by dressing up as an Austrian peasant, find the American forces, and bring them to the Katzel. And he had escaped. He had made escape attempts 3 times before the battle, so he knew the surrounding area pretty well. And like every day he was at Katzwitter, he had kept in shape. So yeah, he exercised, he jogged around the courtyard. So he was pretty in shape. He knew the area, so it was a logical choice to send him. And I suppose Lee didn't have much of a choice because like the Waffen-SS was about to like break into the Katzel, so they sent him. So yeah, he pretended to be an Austrian peasant by gathering herbs, and so somehow he must have been done a really good performance because the SS troops just let him by. Because if they had forced him to talk, then it would not have ended well because he was French, and even if he knew German, he should not be having a French accent. So by the time that he found help, the Waffen-SS was about to fire anti-tank right into the Katzel gatehouse. But at that moment, Barotra returned with Major Kramers and many more soldiers than there were at the Katzel. So the Waffen-SS promptly fled, and everyone celebrated. There were a couple of military journalists who went around talking to the French VIPs. And yeah, that was the end of the battle. After 12 hours, it had ended. So now we get to the aftermath. So after Kramers arrived, the French prisoners, they stayed at the nearby village of Innsbruck for the night. And then when day came, they were flown back to France. And in a matter of days, they all returned home safe and sound. And in the meantime, the German soldiers, even after all the work that they had done to defend the battle, they were still taken to be prisoners of war, unfortunately. But Kurt Siegfried, remember the officer, he received a testimonial from all of the prisoners. It was signed by all of them, and it said that he had assisted with the defense of Katzwitter. So that let him off a bit. So he only got 2 years in prison, which was pretty decent considering he was an SS officer, and all because of that testimonial. And yeah, so that was nice. And then years afterwards, many of the French prisoners managed to continue their careers, and they also published memoirs, insulting each other, as per usual. And Paul Renaud, former French Prime Minister, he was elected to the Chamber of Deputies in France, and he served in politics and then he retired. He published his memoirs insulting his political enemies. And Jean Barotra, on the other hand, the tennis player, he continued playing tennis until he was in his 90s. And he died at the ripe old age of 95. And although the French prisoners had decent lives afterwards, I couldn't say the same for Captain Lee, unfortunately. He did receive a Distinguished Service Cross for his efforts in protecting the battle, but unfortunately, his life just went completely downhill. So he got into debt a lot. He divorced twice, and then he died in his 50s of alcohol poisoning. And Gongo, who had died in the battle, he's now considered an Austrian hero, a national hero for protecting the French prisoners and sacrificing his life for them. Although he isn't actually Austrian, he's German, but he made his last stand in Austria, so that's what matters. So what was the significance of this battle? Why is it so important? So although it's a relatively minor incident, the prisoners of the battle the prisoner of the castle were really important because they were important figures in France before the war, and they would continue, and many of them would be continuing to be after the war, as I've mentioned. And a second thing is the courage that everyone displayed. So we have people like Andreas Krobot and Vladimir Kukovic for delivering the messages to Gongo and Kramers. And we have Captain Jack Lee for agreeing to come assist the prisoners. We have the 5 prisoners who fought and aided in the defense. We have Kurt Siegfried Schroeder, who defected as a Nazi officer. And of course, you have Gongo, who ultimately gave his life during the battle. And all of them could have faced very dire consequences, especially the German soldiers, the German Austrian soldiers, because they were, as I mentioned earlier, Waffen-SS troops executed deserters. So, yeah, it really did say a lot about their spirit, and especially Schroeder and Gongo. They were before the battle, they were really important officers. They were career soldiers. You would have never distinguished them from so many other majors and officers in the SS and the Wehrmacht. But their conviction, when it came to defending the castle, was what set them apart. So it does go to show so many people were just tired of the war by then, just wanted to make the best choice. And finally, the sheer incredibility. Who would have thought that, for whatever reasons, German and American soldiers would fight together to defend French prisoners, aided by Czech and Croatian cook and electrician in an Austrian castle. Just so many people worked together to ensure the safety of everyone involved, and it's really amazing. So I guess this concludes. I'll just conclude with a quote from Captain Lee when he was interviewed a few years before his death. When he described the battle, well, it was just the darndest thing. So, yeah, that concludes my presentation. Do any of you have any questions about anything that wasn't clear? No questions? Oh.
I just want to say I really enjoyed.
Oh, thank you.
Me too.
Yeah, so I guess that's the
What?
end.
Do we know what arms the actual defenders had?
Uh,
Standard issue rifles?
Yeah, rifles and some hand pistols, I think. Yeah, no heavy artillery at all. Yeah, and they didn't. It's just very light equipment. Right. Else? Yeah, Lee.
Do you know how one would become a military journalist? Do they still have those?
I am not sure. I believe they do, but I wouldn't know about the process to become one. Oh, also fun fact, one of the military journalists who interviewed the people at Itter, he would later become the premier of Quebec, so the governor of Quebec. So that was interesting. Okay, anyone
I was
else?
looking for another job. That's interesting. That's
Which
crazy.
is 4 steps?
What?
Just saying 4 steps.
We're almost applying on LinkedIn to become military journalists. Okay.
Okay.
Great job. Great job.
Thank you for watching.